The sights and sounds seen here were what one would frequently see in the Five Points district of Denver in the early 20th century. Denver's black population was established around the same time as the city's inception due to the presence of a group known as exodusters. This refers to enslaved people in the South who moved west after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, freeing them. They first stopped in Kansas, and many found their way to Denver and other parts of Colorado. Despite this, the people of Five Points weren't discouraged, forging a cultural identity that many compared to the arts revolution occurring around the same time in Harlem, dubbed the Harlem of the West. Much of the artistic creation happening was jazz music. Throughout the neighborhood, there were various jazz clubs to be found fully swinging at night, the most notable being the Rossonian Hotel, which hosted some of jazz's all-time greats such as B.B. King, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong. Part of the reasoning for the high concentration of these cultural landmarks that they all fell into the same general area, located around locations listed in the Green Book. The Green Book was a travel guide for African Americans during the Jim Crow era. Locations listed in the book were places that were deemed safe for them to stay the night or grab a bite to eat. Every Green Book location in Denver was situated in Five Points, which gave a rough outline of where African Americans could or could not go. Jazz was being performed everywhere you went during the glory days of the neighborhood, with one of the first notable venues being the Rice and Rice Confectionery and Ice Cream Parlor. Other notable venues included the Casino Ballroom, Rice's Tap Room and Oven, and the Voters Club. Many of these venues were located on Welton Street, which was often referred to as the Welton Strip due to its liveliness. This situated all of the cultural points in the same area and allowed them to thrive in the process. The arts weren't the only thing thriving in the neighborhood. Business was booming, and it was home to the first ever black female millionaire, Madam C.J. Walker. Walker was the owner of a very successful hair care line, as she herself suffered from ailments that worsened her hair. Another notable black business owner of the time was Benny Hooper. Benny owned one of the busiest hotels in the neighborhood that specifically catered to working black men. He also owned the Casino Ballroom. Looking at all of these factors compared to the neighborhood now, one might be left scratching their head. The jazz scene is, at its best, still grabbing at the past, and at its worst, a faint imitation of what it used to be. And in terms of businesses, Denver is in the bottom 10 cities in the United States in terms of black-owned businesses, with a 1.4%. The main problem at hand is gentrification. Gentrification is the process of white people moving into predominantly minority communities and implementing their own cultural values in place of the ones previously established by the communities there before them. Denver's Five Points neighborhood is a prime example of how gentrification kills culture. Five Points was once known as the Harlem of the West and went from one of the most prominent jazz communities and cultural centers in the West to a dull imitation of its former self. The evolution of Five Points shows the effects of socioeconomic and political borders. Those borders were crossed by white people when they implemented their own ideas of culture into the neighborhood. What was once a forced safe place for the black community has changed into a hipster's paradise, with borders formed by socioeconomic barriers that were implied due to the redlining and segregation occurring at the time. Much of the area's music scene now consists of indie rock and folk music, with many music festivals to support. The jazz clubs now replaced with microbreweries and coffee shops. The only remaining signs of what was once a glowing beacon of African American culture are murals on the wall of the great creativity that used to be omnipresent around the streets. Many people point to the murals that litter the streets as a large cultural landmark that give the neighborhood personality. Many of the over 90 murals that can be found in the area tried to pay homage to black culture by portraying icons of the past, but compared to what was once there, it feels very insincere, especially when many of them were painted by artists whose culture does not relate to the Five Points and black tradition. Also now lacking from Five Points is the name itself. The city council members changed the name to Rhino, also known as the River Arts District, to make it easier for houses to be sold. The name Rhino came from warehouses about a mile northwest of Five Points. The plan was to change these warehouses to a bustling community, which then coined the term Rhino. But it then bled into other communities, including Five Points. This is because many of the white people who were interested in moving into the area were put off by the name because of the association Five Points had with crime and poverty. Five Points earned the association of violence after consistently being the neighborhood with the most violent crimes, according to the city of Denver. The leading cause for this was the skyrocketing costs of housing. As early as the 1930s, landlords were pushing up prices on rent while simultaneously ignoring the community built by black homeowners. According to a news article written by the Denver Star, a black-owned news publication based out of Five Points, many black people felt abandoned by their government, complaining through this article about how the community was abandoned, then expected to move when others wanted the land. The prices stayed high for the remainder of the century until the majority of the black community had no choice but to move out. Rhino went from consisting to 75% African Americans to now only 14%. The drop-off is drastic, but considering all the factors that led to it, it's far from surprising. What's left now is an odd mix of the majority white population who try to ignore the past and move forward, and those who still focus on it. Ink Coffee Shop, which moved into the neighborhood in 2014, displayed a sign that read, "Happily gentrifying the neighborhood since 2014. Behavior like this shows that many of the residents do not understand the significance of the history that took place where they now live, and unless far more effort is taken to restore some of the elements of what used to be, change is unlikely. It is a complete betrayal of the African American community to kick them out of the land designated to them and relish in the culture that was created by socioeconomic and political issues. No matter the connotation one views it with, gentrification has completely changed what Five Points represents, even down to the name. A neighborhood once known as the Harlem of the West, full of black-owned businesses that fueled a thriving economy, is now one of the many in the city filled with microbreweries and cafes. The elements that attracted the greatest artists to play jazz are slowly fading into the past, and the venues in which they performed are boarded up and up for sale.